The autumn sun cast long shadows across Denver International Airport's soaring white tent-like roof as Marcus Chen stood with Scout in the early morning darkness of Gate B7. The airport was still quiet at this hour, that magical time before the chaos of the day descended upon the terminals. Marcus had always loved this moment, this calm before the storm, when the massive facility felt almost peaceful. The white architecture of the airport gleamed against the breaking dawn, and Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself for another day of work. Scout, a muscular German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a sleek black coat, pressed against Marcus's leg, their sacred ritual before every single shift. This wasn't just a habit. It was a moment of connection, a silent affirmation of the bond they'd built together over 4 years of working side by side through thousands of travelers and countless situations. Marcus had been a TSA officer for 12 long years before Scout entered his life. Those first 12 years had been competent but hollow. He'd followed procedures, caught contraband, kept people safe, all the things the job demanded. But there was something missing, something that made the work feel mechanical rather than meaningful. Then Scout arrived as a nervous 2-year-old pup with uncertain eyes and trembling limbs. She'd come from a training facility upstate, and honestly, Marcus remembered thinking she seemed too anxious for the job. The other handlers had their doubts too. Nobody believed this anxious, skittish dog would become the detection legend she eventually became. Some of the veteran officers actually joked that she'd wash out within weeks, that her temperament wasn't suited for the pressure of airport security work. But Scout had different plans entirely. Through patience, consistency, and an almost supernatural understanding between handler and dog, she transformed from a nervous pup into a confident professional. Somewhere along the way, she'd also transformed Marcus. Working with Scout had reconnected him to why he'd become a TSA officer in the first place, to protect people, to prevent disasters before they happened, to be someone's guardian angel in uniform. Scout had given his work meaning again. She'd shown him that detection wasn't just about following protocols. It was about intuition, understanding, and the mysterious connection between two beings who trust each other completely. The 4 years they'd spent together had been extraordinary in ways Marcus could barely articulate. They'd been through so much. The nervous breakdowns early on, the moments when Scout seemed to lose confidence in herself, the countless hours of training and bonding. Marcus had studied canine behavior extensively, reading everything he could about how dogs process information, how their senses worked in ways human minds couldn't fully comprehend. He'd learned that Scout's nose contained approximately 300 million olfactory receptors compared to his measly 6 million. He'd learned about the vomeronasal organ that allowed dogs to detect pheromones and chemical compounds invisible to human technology. He'd learned that Scout wasn't just smelling things. She was reading stories written in chemistry, narratives composed in molecules and particles too small for human detection. This knowledge had forged an almost mystical respect between them. Marcus trusted Scout with his life. More importantly, he trusted Scout with other people's lives. When Scout alerted, people listened. When Scout refused to let someone pass, Marcus never questioned her judgment, at least not deeply. He might investigate further, but he never doubted that Scout was responding to something real, something genuine, something that mattered. Scout had never been wrong, not once in 4 years. Her track record was flawless, an impeccable string of successful detections that had built her reputation as one of the finest detection dogs at Denver International Airport. Today felt different though, and Marcus couldn't quite articulate why. There was something in the air, some subtle electricity that made his skin prickle with anticipation. He'd learned to trust his gut over the years. It was a quality that had served him well in law enforcement. His intuition often picked up on patterns his conscious mind hadn't quite registered. Standing there at 6:47 in the morning, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus felt that familiar tingle of premonition. Something significant was about to happen. He didn't know what. He didn't know when. but his body recognized it the way animals recognize the approach of a storm. Scout seemed to sense it too. She was more alert than usual, her ears slightly more forward, her entire being radiating a kind of focused energy. Marcus wondered if she was picking up on his own emotional state. Dogs were mirrors. They reflected the energy of their handlers with uncanny accuracy. If Marcus was anxious, Scout would become anxious. If Marcus was calm, Scout would settle. But this was different. This felt mutual, as if both handler and dog were vibrating on the same frequency, tuned to something the rest of the world hadn't yet perceived. Gate B7 was beginning to wake up. TSA agents took their positions behind the security barriers, checking their equipment and preparing for the morning rush. The metal detectors hummed to life. The X-ray machines began their rhythmic processing of luggage. The bins rolled out in neat stacks, ready to receive the personal items of countless travelers. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. And yet, everything was about to change in ways none of them could have predicted. Around Marcus, tired travelers began to arrive, shuffling through the terminal with the half-conscious movements of people accustomed to early morning travel. Some carried coffee cups as if those beverages were life support systems. Others dragged oversized suitcases with the weariness of frequent flyers. Children rubbed their eyes. Business people checked their phones compulsively. It was the standard morning crowd at Denver International Airport, nothing remarkable, nothing noteworthy. Just the ordinary flow of humanity moving through the airport's terminals, en route to destinations unknown. Then he saw him. The man appeared among the crowd like a figure stepping into focus, and something about him immediately caught Marcus's attention. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2 or 3, with the kind of posture that only military training could produce. Every part of him was perfectly aligned, shoulders back, chin parallel to the ground, movements economical and precise. But it was the uniform that truly commanded attention. It was an immaculate army dress uniform, the kind reserved for official occasions and formal events. Every metal was polished to a mirror shine. Every ribbon was perfectly placed. Every crease in the fabric looked as if it had been cut with a razor blade. The uniform was so perfect, so pristine, that it actually stood out in a crowd of casually dressed travelers. The man wore a captain's insignia on his shoulders, 2 silver bars that indicated rank and authority. His bearing was confident, almost aristocratic. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in his approach. He walked toward the security checkpoint with the kind of assurance that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone whose authority was rarely questioned. He smiled at the TSA agents as he approached, a charming smile that reached his eyes, the kind of smile that put people at ease. Marcus noticed it immediately. That smile, that bearing, that absolute confidence. Marcus would remember that smile for the rest of his life, though he didn't know why yet. He would replay it in his mind 1,000 times in the days and weeks that followed, trying to understand what he might have missed, what signs he should have seen. But at that moment, standing in Gate B7 on an ordinary Tuesday morning in autumn, Marcus simply noted the man's appearance and continued his work. The captain would be processed like everyone else. Security would verify his documents. He would go through the metal detector. He would board his flight. Just another uniformed officer passing through Denver International Airport. Just another day in an otherwise ordinary week. Marcus had no idea that this man, this perfectly dressed, completely confident army captain, would soon shatter every assumption he'd ever made about his partner. He had no idea that Scout was about to demonstrate capabilities that would astound everyone at the airport. He had no idea that the next few minutes would change his understanding of his dog forever. All he knew was that feeling, that electricity in the air, that sense of something momentous approaching like a distant storm. His intuition was screaming at him, preparing him for something he couldn't yet comprehend. Marcus took a deep breath, scratched Scout behind the ears one final time, and prepared for whatever came next. The moment Captain James Mitchell stepped into Scout's proximity, everything exploded. There was no gradual escalation, no slow buildup of concern. It was instantaneous, violent, and absolutely unmistakable. 1 second, Scout was sitting calmly beside Marcus, her body relaxed, her breathing normal, her demeanor professional and composed. The next second, her entire being underwent a transformation so dramatic that it seemed as though someone had flipped a switch deep within her consciousness. Every muscle in her body went rigid, as if she'd been turned to stone. Her legs locked in place. Her spine straightened. Her entire frame became absolutely still, frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated recognition. Marcus felt it before he saw it. The tension in Scout's body transferred through her leash directly into his hand, a sudden jolt of electricity that made him gasp involuntarily. Scout's ears shot forward at a violent angle, standing completely erect atop her head, rotating slightly as if trying to triangulate the source of something she detected. Her breathing, which had been calm and rhythmic just moments before, became rapid and shallow. Marcus could feel her heartbeat accelerating, the pulse in her body becoming almost frantic. Her nostrils flared, expanding to their maximum capacity as she inhaled deeply, drawing in air with an intensity that suggested she was trying to decode something crucial written in the molecular structure of that breath. But it wasn't just a standard alert. Marcus had seen Scout alert hundreds of times over 4 years of partnership. He knew her professional detection behavior, the way she would focus intently on a piece of luggage, or the way she'd circle someone carrying prohibited substances. Those were calculated responses, methodical alerts that communicated "I've found something" with professional precision. This was completely different. This was primal. This was instinctive. This was Scout's entire being screaming a message that transcended her training, that came from somewhere deeper than the behavioral conditioning of her detection work. Scout's muscles tensed with an intensity Marcus had only witnessed once or twice before. Once when a truly dangerous individual with violent felonies had come through the checkpoint, and once during a training exercise involving simulated explosive devices. Her body was preparing for fight or flight, her adrenal glands flooding her system with chemicals designed to maximize her response to a perceived threat. She began to pull backward, not aggressively, but with surprising force and unmistakable purpose. It was as if every instinct in her body was screaming at her to create distance between herself and this man in the immaculate uniform. "Whoa, Scout. What is it, girl?" Marcus tried to keep his voice calm and reassuring, slipping into the soothing tone he used when Scout became anxious. But his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird throwing itself against the bars of its prison. His palms began to sweat almost immediately, moisture collecting in his hands despite the cool morning air of the airport terminal. Marcus's professional training kicked in, telling him to remain composed, to project confidence to the people around him. But internally, his entire nervous system had shifted into high alert. The other TSA officers froze in their positions. Whatever was happening at Marcus's checkpoint, it was unusual enough to capture everyone's attention. Agents looked up from their X-ray machines, their metal detectors, their security stations. The rhythm of the checkpoint, that steady, predictable flow of travelers and screening processes, suddenly stuttered and paused. Everyone sensed that something significant was occurring, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. The uniformed captain's confident smile faltered almost imperceptibly, replaced by confusion and a flash of embarrassment. His hand moved slightly toward his chest, as if instinctively reaching for the medals on his uniform, checking that they were still in place. Marcus could see the man's jaw tightening, the muscles in his neck becoming more prominent. The absolute assurance that had characterized his approach to the checkpoint wavered, replaced by uncertainty. Scout wouldn't stop. She continued her agitated behavior with an intensity that seemed to be escalating rather than subsiding. She circled backward, keeping her intense gaze locked on the uniformed man, her entire body language screaming danger in a way that Marcus had never witnessed before. This wasn't a professional alert to contraband or explosives. This was something far more primal, far more basic. Scout was communicating fear, not her own fear, but her perception of a threat so profound that every cell in her body was reacting to it. Her whine escalated, beginning as a low sound and rising in pitch and intensity. It was the sound of a dog sensing something fundamentally wrong, something that violated her instincts at a level deeper than training could reach. The whine had a desperate quality to it, almost pleading, as if Scout was trying desperately to communicate something crucial to Marcus, something about this man that her senses were detecting, but that she couldn't articulate in human language. Other passengers began backing away from the checkpoint, creating space around the drama that was unfolding before them. A businessman in a dark suit took several steps backward, his phone momentarily forgotten. A woman traveling with two young children quickly moved them away from the area, pulling them closer to her body protectively. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. The entire energy of the checkpoint had shifted. The calm morning routine had been disrupted by something undefined but clearly significant. "It's okay, Scout. It's okay," Marcus whispered, his voice betraying the uncertainty roiling beneath his professional exterior. He tried every calming technique in his extensive arsenal. He took deep breaths, hoping Scout would mirror his respiration and calm herself. He modulated his voice to the lowest, most soothing tones he could produce. He even reached into his pocket with his free hand and retrieved Scout's favorite treat, a small piece of freeze-dried liver that she normally responded to with immediate enthusiasm. Nothing worked. The treat sat in his open palm, completely ignored. Scout's attention remained locked on the captain, her body language communicating nothing but urgency and distress. She didn't want comfort. She didn't want treats. She wanted Marcus to understand something, to perceive what she was perceiving, to see the threat that her magnificent senses had detected. Supervisor Patricia Walsh, a veteran with 20 years in law enforcement and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm in chaotic situations, hurried over from her position near the security checkpoint. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, her expression professionally neutral. She'd seen unusual situations before. She'd been trained for them, prepared for them. But the intensity of Scout's reaction was clearly unusual even by her extensive experience standards. Patricia examined the captain's military ID with meticulous care, turning it over in her hands, checking for any signs of forgery or tampering. The identification appeared absolutely flawless. No visible scratches, no inconsistencies in the holographic security features. The photo matched the man standing before them, same face, same confident expression, same military bearing. No red flags. Her fingers traced across the edges of the card, checking for any signs of alteration. Nothing. It was genuine, authentic, completely legitimate. His travel documents were equally pristine. His airline ticket was printed clearly. His boarding pass was properly formatted. Everything about his paperwork screamed legitimacy and official authorization. "Everything checks out, Marcus," Patricia said, though doubt flickered unmistakably across her face. The words were meant to be reassuring, but both officers could hear the uncertainty beneath them. Marcus felt torn, absolutely, completely torn between two competing realities. His rational mind, trained in security protocols and procedures, told him the man was legitimate. His professional training said to clear him, let him proceed, move on to the next traveler. But Scout was telling him something completely different. Scout was communicating with every fiber of her being that something was fundamentally wrong, that this man represented a threat that transcended normal security categories. In 4 years of partnership, Scout had never been wrong. "It's okay, Scout. It's okay," Marcus whispered again, his voice carrying a tone of gentle reassurance that belied the storm of anxiety churning within his chest. He'd used these words hundreds of times before with Scout, when she was nervous during thunderstorms, when she was recovering from a minor injury, when the pressure of her work became temporarily overwhelming. The words were meant to be a lifeline, a signal that everything was under control, that Marcus had things handled. But this time, the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Scout could sense his doubt. Dogs were incredibly perceptive creatures, capable of reading their handlers' emotional states with unsettling accuracy. Scout knew that Marcus didn't believe his own reassurances. He tried every calming technique in his extensive arsenal, drawing on years of training and countless interactions with anxious animals. First came deep breathing. Marcus deliberately slowed his own respiratory rate, making his breaths deep and measured, hoping that Scout would unconsciously mirror his physiology and begin to calm herself. This was a well-documented phenomenon in canine behavior. Dogs often synchronize their breathing patterns with their handlers, using the handler's calm as a template for their own emotional regulation. But Scout remained agitated, her breathing continuing its rapid, shallow pattern, her body language refusing to soften even slightly. Marcus progressed to vocalization techniques, modulating his voice to the lowest, most soothing tones he could produce. He'd attended training seminars on canine communication that emphasized the power of voice pitch and tone. Dogs responded better to lower frequencies. They found them calming and reassuring. Marcus dropped his voice almost to a whisper, creating sounds that were as gentle and non-threatening as possible. "Easy, girl. Easy now. I'm right here. Everything's fine. Scout, easy." The words formed a rhythmic mantra, repeated with slight variations, designed to communicate safety and security. Nothing worked. Scout's attention remained locked on the captain with laser-like intensity, as if she could see through the man's skin into whatever lay beneath, as if her extraordinary senses were perceiving something that transcended normal security categories. Her body language communicated nothing but urgency and distress. The muscles in her neck remained taut. Her ears stayed erect. Her eyes, usually warm and intelligent, had taken on a wild quality, reflecting an intensity that spoke to something primal awakening within her consciousness. In desperation, Marcus reached into his pocket with his free hand and retrieved Scout's favorite treat, a small piece of freeze-dried liver that he kept for emergency situations. This was Scout's kryptonite, her one weakness, the treat that could normally pull her attention away from almost anything. In training scenarios when they practiced her focus and discipline, this was the reward she worked toward. The freeze-dried liver was more powerful than toys, more compelling than praise. Under normal circumstances, Scout would respond to it with immediate enthusiasm, her entire demeanor shifting from work mode to reward anticipation mode. He extended his open palm toward her, the small piece of liver visible in the center of his hand. "Scout, treat. Look, girl, treat." His voice carried a forced cheerfulness, a desperate hopefulness that this simple offering might break through whatever was consuming her attention. The aroma of the freeze-dried liver, distinctive, pungent, normally irresistible, wafted between them. In any other circumstance, Scout would have abandoned everything to claim this reward. Scout's eyes flickered toward the treat for perhaps 1/10 of a second, the briefest acknowledgement of its existence. But then her attention snapped back to the captain with a violence that made Marcus flinch. The treat might as well have been invisible. Scout was communicating something far more crucial than hunger or reward-seeking. She was communicating that whatever she detected in this man transcended normal motivational categories. This wasn't about treats or praise or typical behavioral reinforcement. This was about something deeper, something that bypassed her training entirely and spoke directly to her instincts. Other passengers began backing away from the checkpoint, unconsciously responding to the palpable tension that now permeated the area. A businessman in a dark suit, who had been standing in line for the metal detector, took several deliberate steps backward, his mobile phone momentarily forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. His face registered confusion mixed with concern, the universal expression of someone witnessing something outside normal experience. A woman traveling with 2 young children, perhaps 6 and 8 years old, quickly moved them away from the immediate vicinity, pulling them closer to her body in a protective gesture. The children, picking up on their mother's anxiety, stopped their playful banter and pressed against her legs silently. An elderly couple, probably in their 70s, exchanged worried glances that communicated decades of shared understanding. Their hands found each other almost instinctively, a physical affirmation of their partnership. They were the kind of people who had seen much in their lifetime, who had developed sophisticated instincts for reading situations. Whatever was happening at this checkpoint, they recognized it as something significant. They weren't panicked. Their generation had lived through genuine crises and could distinguish between genuine danger and unusual circumstances. But they were definitely concerned. The entire energy of Gate B7 had fundamentally shifted. The calm morning routine, that predictable rhythm of travelers moving through security screening, had been disrupted by something undefined but clearly significant. The orderly flow had become hesitant. The casual conversations had ceased. Everyone in the vicinity, consciously or unconsciously, had recognized that something unusual was occurring. Supervisor Patricia Walsh approached the checkpoint with measured steps, her bearing reflecting the authority that came from 20 years in law enforcement. Patricia was the kind of professional who had trained extensively for unusual situations. She'd attended advanced security workshops. She'd studied criminal psychology. She'd worked through simulations of potential threats and dangerous scenarios. Her demeanor was professionally neutral, her movements controlled and deliberate. She gave nothing away in her expression, a skill she'd honed over 2 decades of handling sensitive situations. Patricia examined the captain's military identification card with meticulous care, treating it as though it were a priceless artifact deserving of detailed examination. She turned it over slowly in her hands, studying both the front and back, checking for any signs of forgery or tampering that might indicate an altered document. The identification appeared absolutely flawless. The holographic security features, those complex, three-dimensional images that shifted color when viewed from different angles, seemed completely authentic. The photo was crystal clear, matching the man standing before them perfectly. His confident expression in the photograph mirrored his current bearing, suggesting continuity and legitimacy. Patricia's fingers traced carefully across the edges of the card, checking for any evidence of the kind of alterations that counterfeiters sometimes attempted. She felt for bumps, irregularities, signs of tampering at the edges where legitimate cards were often opened and forged. Nothing. The card's edges were perfectly smooth. The cardstock felt authentic, exactly the weight and texture of legitimate military identification. No red flags emerged. No inconsistencies presented themselves. By every objective standard, this was a genuine document issued by legitimate military authorities. His travel documents were equally pristine and professionally formatted. His airline ticket was printed clearly with all required information. The booking reference number was properly formatted. His destination was Washington, D.C., Flight 247, departing at 8:15 a.m., a reasonable morning flight for someone traveling on official business. His boarding pass was properly generated through the airline system, complete with TSA pre-check status, indicating that the airline had already conducted preliminary security verification. Everything about his paperwork screamed legitimacy and official authorization. Everything communicated that this was a genuine military officer conducting legitimate travel. "Everything checks out, Marcus," Patricia said finally, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority. The words were meant to be reassuring, meant to validate that proper procedures had been followed and everything was in order. But both officers could hear the uncertainty beneath those professional words. Patricia's eyes held doubt. Her jaw was slightly tighter than normal. The confidence that usually characterized her bearing had developed small hairline fractures. Marcus felt torn, absolutely, completely torn between two competing realities that seemed fundamentally incompatible. His rational mind, trained extensively in security protocols and procedures through years of TSA work, told him clearly that the man was legitimate. Every objective measure pointed toward authenticity. The man's documents were flawless. His credentials were genuine. His military bearing was authentic. His story made sense. His presence here made sense. His professional training said to clear him immediately. Let him proceed through the checkpoint. Move on to the next traveler in line. Maintain the flow of airport operations. But Scout was telling him something completely different. Scout was communicating with every fiber of her physical being, with every muscle and nerve ending, that something was fundamentally wrong. That this man, despite his perfect uniform and authentic documents and genuine military credentials, represented a threat that transcended normal security categories. That something about his presence violated Scout's deepest instincts in ways that her training had prepared her to recognize and respond to. In 4 years of partnership, through hundreds of screenings and countless interactions, Scout had never been wrong. Patricia began a secondary security search with the kind of methodical precision that came from 2 decades of law enforcement experience. She moved systematically, following the established protocols that had been drilled into her consciousness through countless training sessions and real-world applications. Her gloved hands began at the captain's shoulders, moving downward across his chest in smooth, controlled motions. She checked for concealed items in the interior pockets of his dress uniform jacket, her fingers probing gently but thoroughly. She patted down his sides, his waist, the area where a concealed weapon might typically be hidden. Her movements were professional and respectful, acknowledging the man's rank while maintaining the security imperative. Scout continued her agitated behavior throughout this process, refusing to settle or relax even as Patricia conducted her thorough physical search. The dog's whine maintained its desperate pitch, her body language continuing to communicate urgent distress. Marcus found himself gripping Scout's leash more tightly, partly to maintain control and partly seeking reassurance from the physical connection. The tension between what Patricia was discovering, nothing suspicious, and what Scout was communicating, profound distress, created a cognitive dissonance that was increasingly difficult for Marcus to reconcile. Patricia worked her way down the captain's legs, checking the seams of his dress trousers, patting down the areas above and below his knees where small items might be concealed. She examined the hem of his trousers carefully, looking for any evidence of tampering or hidden pockets. Still nothing. She moved to his feet, checking the interior of his polished black dress shoes, her hands probing gently inside to ensure nothing was hidden within the sole or heel. The shoes were exactly what they appeared to be: regulation military footwear, properly maintained and completely unremarkable. "Nothing here," Patricia confirmed, her voice carrying a note of professional reassurance. She moved to his carry-on bag, a standard black rolling suitcase that bore the kind of wear marks consistent with frequent travel. She opened it methodically, conducting the kind of thorough secondary search that TSA protocols required. The bag's contents were modest and professional: a laptop computer in a protective sleeve, a toiletries kit sealed in a clear plastic bag, several changes of underwear and socks neatly folded, a dress shirt still in its dry cleaning plastic, and a paperback novel with a bookmark indicating the reader was about halfway through the story. Patricia examined each item carefully. The laptop appeared standard, a Dell computer of the type used by thousands of business travelers daily. The toiletries kit contained nothing unusual: toothbrush, toothpaste, deodorant, shaving cream, a small bottle of cologne. The clothing was military-issue underwear and regulation socks. The dress shirt was pressed and ready for official wear. The novel was a contemporary thriller, nothing controversial or suspicious. Everything about the contents of the bag screamed normalcy and legitimacy. "Everything appears in order," Patricia said finally, her professional tone carrying an undertone of uncertainty. She closed the suitcase and looked at Marcus, her eyes reflecting the internal conflict that now mirrored his own. They'd both been trained to trust objective evidence, to follow the data where it led. The data screamed that this man was legitimate, and yet Scout's reaction was equally objective, equally real, equally data-based. Two different sensory systems were communicating completely contradictory information. Marcus felt sweat accumulating on his palms despite the cool morning temperature of the airport terminal. His heart continued its rapid, irregular rhythm. Everything inside him was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, but he had no evidence to point to, no objective data to support his growing unease. This was the fundamental tension of his position. He worked in a profession that demanded evidence, documentation, objective proof. And yet his partner was communicating something that transcended those categories, something that spoke to a deeper truth that his professional training couldn't quite access. As Patricia began to clear the captain for passage, she noticed something minute, so small that it would have been easy to miss entirely under normal circumstances. It was a tiny inconsistency in the airline booking information displayed on her tablet. The ticket had been issued under J. Mitchell, but the military identification card she just examined clearly read James R. Mitchell. A small difference, almost negligible. The kind of thing that could easily be explained by administrative shortcuts or nickname preferences. Most security personnel would have let it pass without a second thought. But Patricia had developed the habit over 20 years of questioning small inconsistencies. She'd learned that tiny discrepancies often meant everything. She'd seen forged documents that were nearly perfect except for one small detail. She'd caught criminals who'd made one small mistake in otherwise carefully constructed cover stories. Her intuition, that same intuitive sense that Scout possessed, was suddenly activated by this small inconsistency. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. She turned her tablet toward the captain, pointing to the booking information. "Sir, I noticed the ticket says J. Mitchell, but your ID shows James R. Mitchell. That's a bit unusual. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Her voice remained professionally neutral, but her body language had shifted subtly. The casual confidence of a routine screening had transformed into something more focused, more investigative. The captain's response was immediately defensive. His smile, which had been attempting to recover throughout the screening, faltered completely. His jaw tightened noticeably. His hand moved to his chest, not to touch his medals this time, but in a gesture that suggested sudden anxiety. "Oh, that's just. I go by J at the airline. Administrative thing. My full name is James, but I've always used J for booking purposes." The explanation came quickly, too quickly, with the kind of desperation that suggested he was improvising rather than recounting a familiar fact. Patricia didn't accept the explanation immediately. Instead, she excused herself and made a discreet phone call to the airline's verification team. This wasn't an accusation or an indication that she suspected fraud. It was simply following procedure, verifying information when inconsistencies arose. She walked several steps away from the checkpoint, her voice low enough that the captain couldn't hear her clearly. Marcus watched her face as she listened to whatever information the airline representative was providing to her. What happened next occurred in slow motion from Marcus's perspective. He watched Patricia's facial expression change, watched the color drain slightly from her cheeks, watched her eyes widen in understanding, watched her entire demeanor shift from routine professionalism to acute concern. She said something brief to the person on the phone, then disconnected the call. She stood motionless for a moment, processing what she just learned, gathering herself before turning back to face the checkpoint. When Patricia's eyes found Marcus across the checkpoint, the message was unmistakable. The invisible had become visible. The suspicion had become confirmation. The inconsistency had revealed a truth that no amount of perfect uniforms or authentic-appearing documents could conceal. Patricia hung up the phone slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the adrenaline that must have been flooding her system. Scout's agitation seemed to intensify in that moment, as if the dog somehow sensed that the truth was finally emerging, that Patricia had perceived what Scout had known all along. The dog's whine reached a new pitch, not of panic, but of validation. Scout had been right. Her senses had detected something real, something significant. The human world was finally catching up to what the canine world had known from the very beginning. Marcus felt the moment shift beneath him like tectonic plates realigning. Everything was about to change. Everything he thought he understood about this seemingly routine morning was about to be shattered by a truth that Patricia had just uncovered, a truth that Scout had detected with perfect, undeniable clarity from the very beginning. Patricia's voice was steady and controlled as she approached Marcus, her professional demeanor intact even though her eyes communicated urgency and concern. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" she asked quietly, tilting her head slightly to indicate that she wanted to discuss something away from the captain's immediate hearing range. Marcus nodded, his throat suddenly dry, his entire nervous system on high alert. He guided Scout away from the checkpoint, moving toward a quieter corner of Gate B7 where their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the growing number of passengers who had begun to realize that something unusual was transpiring. "The real Captain James Mitchell," Patricia began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is currently stationed in Ramstein Air Base in Germany. According to the military personnel database I just spoke with, he's been there for the past 8 months. He's not on any flight manifests. He's not traveling anywhere. He's definitely not returning from a Middle Eastern deployment." Patricia paused, letting the implications of this statement sink into Marcus's consciousness. The man at the checkpoint is using forged military credentials. Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was hearing. The implications seemed impossibly large, impossibly significant. A forged military credential at a major airport. An imposter in a stolen identity. Someone who had nearly successfully boarded a commercial flight carrying hundreds of innocent passengers. The enormity of what Scout had prevented from happening began to crystallize in his mind. "How is that possible?" Marcus heard himself asking, though intellectually he understood that people committed fraud every single day. But the specificity of what had just been uncovered, the meticulousness of the deception, the apparent authenticity of every element, spoke to a level of sophistication that was genuinely rare. This wasn't an amateur operation. This was someone who had carefully planned, methodically prepared, constructed an identity so convincingly that it had passed the scrutiny of all human inspectors, until Patricia had noticed that single, tiny inconsistency. Patricia's expression was grim. "I don't know yet, but we need to detain him immediately. This is federal jurisdiction now. Using forged military credentials is a serious offense. We need to contact the authorities and secure the area." She began reaching for her radio, but first she looked at Marcus with an expression that conveyed profound understanding. "Scout knew. Your dog knew exactly what was wrong before any of us had the slightest idea." Marcus looked down at Scout, and what he saw in his partner's eyes transformed his entire understanding of his dog's capabilities. Scout wasn't just performing her trained detection work. Scout had accessed something deeper, something that transcended the training protocols and standard behavioral responses that had been instilled in her through her professional preparation. Scout had perceived a truth about this individual that no training could have prepared her to recognize with such absolute certainty. The realization was staggering. Marcus had always understood that Scout possessed extraordinary olfactory capabilities. He'd read the research. He'd studied the anatomy of the canine nose, learned about the vomeronasal organ, understood the theoretical basis for why dogs could detect explosive residues, narcotics, and other contraband. But what Scout had just demonstrated existed in a category beyond that technical knowledge. Scout had detected something far more subtle, far more complex, the biological markers of extreme psychological deception. When a human being is engaged in profound deception, particularly deception that carries severe consequences for discovery, their body undergoes measurable physiological changes. Under extreme stress and psychological pressure, the human nervous system releases a cascade of chemical compounds into the bloodstream and respiratory system. Adrenaline floods the circulation, causing increased heart rate and blood pressure. Cortisol, the stress hormone, spikes dramatically. Acetylcholine activates in the nervous system, triggering specific neurological responses. Norepinephrine increases, sharpening focus while simultaneously creating anxiety. These stress hormones don't remain confined within the body. They're excreted through multiple pathways, through sweat glands in the skin, through respiration in the breath, through the olfactory markers that an individual releases into their immediate environment. For a human being, these chemical signals are completely imperceptible. The differences are too minute, the concentrations too diluted for human olfactory systems to detect. But for a creature whose nose contained approximately 300 million olfactory receptors, compared to Marcus's measly 6 million, these chemical signals were like beacon lights blazing in the darkness. Scout had been reading this man's body chemistry. While he maintained an outwardly composed military demeanor, internally his body was screaming in terror. His stress levels were elevated dramatically beyond what would be normal for someone simply passing through airport security. Scout's extraordinary sensory apparatus had detected the mismatch between his external presentation and his internal physiological state. She had perceived the biological truth of his deception, written in the language of chemistry and molecules. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he looked at Scout with a profound sense of awe and respect. Scout had just demonstrated capabilities that transcended standard detection work. She hadn't smelled explosives or contraband. She had smelled dishonesty itself. She had perceived the chemical signature of a human being engaged in desperate deception, risking everything on a dangerous gamble. Scout possessed a gift that went far beyond what her training had prepared her for. She could sense the human soul's dishonesty written in biochemistry. As Patricia signaled to other TSA officers through an inconspicuous radio communication, Scout's agitation began to shift. The dog's whining decreased in intensity. Her body language, while still alert, began to show subtle signs of relief. Scout seemed to understand that her message had finally been received, that the human world was finally acting on the truth that the canine world had known from the beginning. It was as if Scout had been desperately trying to communicate something crucial, and now that communication had finally succeeded. The officers began moving toward the checkpoint with purposeful strides. The captain's facial expression changed dramatically as he realized something was fundamentally wrong. His confident military bearing began to crack. He looked around the checkpoint, suddenly aware that the security procedures had shifted, that the dynamic had changed entirely. Officers were approaching him with expressions that communicated official authority and serious intent. The comfortable assumption that he would simply pass through security and board his flight had shattered completely. Marcus kept Scout close as the situation began to unfold. He praised his partner quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Good girl, Scout. Good girl, you knew. You always knew." Scout pressed against his leg, her body finally beginning to relax as the physical validation of her alert became undeniable. Everything she had communicated through her behavior was being confirmed in real time. Her instincts had been absolutely, perfectly correct. The captain's eyes darted toward the exit, his body beginning to tense as if he might attempt to flee. But TSA officers had already moved to block all escape routes. Security was closing in systematically, their training and experience evident in their coordinated movements. The man who had walked into Gate B7 that morning as a confident imposter was about to be detained. The lie that had been so carefully constructed was collapsing. The truth that Scout had perceived was becoming undeniable. Marcus stood with Scout, watching as the situation unfolded, profound gratitude flooding through him for his partner's extraordinary abilities. Scout had protected hundreds of innocent travelers with nothing more than her senses and her instincts. She had prevented a dangerous criminal from escaping. She had done what no human technology, no standard security protocol, could have accomplished alone. Scout had perceived the truth that lay beneath the surface of human deception. The imposter's facade crumbled like a structure whose foundation had suddenly been exposed as fundamentally unstable. The confident military bearing that had characterized his approach to the checkpoint disintegrated in an instant. His shoulders, which had been held in rigid military precision, suddenly slouched. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck became prominent and visible. His eyes, which had maintained that charming confidence throughout the screening process, now darted frantically around Gate B7, searching for an escape route that had suddenly become impossible to find. For a microsecond, Marcus watched the man's internal calculation occur in real time. The imposter was assessing his options, running through scenarios in his mind, with the desperation of someone who had just realized that his carefully constructed plan was collapsing around him. For months, he had prepared this deception. For months, he had gathered the false credentials, practiced the military bearing, constructed the identity that would allow him to slip through security undetected. He had been so close, mere seconds away from walking through the gate, boarding the aircraft, disappearing into the transportation system with his false credentials and fabricated story intact. But Scout had destroyed that plan with nothing more than her extraordinary senses and her unwillingness to compromise on what she knew to be true. The man bolted toward the terminal exit with sudden, violent desperation. His movements were no longer controlled or measured. They were the frantic, panicked movements of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed. He pushed past a family of tourists, knocking over their rolling suitcase in his haste. He weaved through the growing crowd of passengers who had begun to gather, sensing that something dramatic was occurring at Gate B7. His polished black dress shoes scraped against the airport's tile floor as he ran, the sound of his desperate flight echoing through the terminal. The TSA officers reacted with the precision that came from extensive training and professional preparation. Officer James Rodriguez, a former Marine with 15 years of security experience, moved to intercept the fleeing suspect. Rodriguez's athletic build and years of tactical training made him perfectly suited for pursuit operations. He moved with economical efficiency, cutting off the man's most direct path to the exit. Two additional officers, Sarah Chen and Marcus Williamson, flanked the suspect from either side, limiting his ability to escape in alternative directions. The imposter attempted to evade Rodriguez by feinting left, then moving right with desperate speed. But Rodriguez anticipated the movement, his body already positioned to intercept. The man tried to push past the officer, using his shoulder as a battering ram. Rodriguez absorbed the impact with relative ease, his larger frame and superior positioning preventing the suspect from breaking through his defensive stance. Within seconds, the pursuit became a full containment operation. The suspect found himself surrounded, with no viable escape routes remaining. TSA officers closed in from multiple directions with controlled movements that prevented panic while maintaining absolute authority over the situation. Other passengers began backing away, instinctively creating space for the security operation to unfold. Children were pulled closer to their parents. Business people halted their movements mid-stride. Everyone in the vicinity suddenly became acutely aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a real security incident unfolding in real time. The imposter made one final attempt to break through the encirclement, lunging toward a gap between two officers with the desperation of a cornered animal. But Rodriguez and Officer Chen moved simultaneously, their bodies creating an impenetrable barrier. The suspect collided against their combined resistance and stumbled backward, the realization finally crystallizing in his consciousness that escape was impossible. His body seemed to deflate, the fight draining out of him as the reality of his situation became undeniable. Within moments, TSA security had restrained him. Officer Williamson produced zip ties, the plastic restraints used for securing detainees, and secured the man's wrists behind his back with practiced efficiency. The suspect didn't resist at this point. The desperation had transformed into resignation. His body went limp, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his complete and total failure. The carefully constructed identity, the months of preparation, the meticulous planning, All of it had been destroyed in the span of minutes by a dog's extraordinary perception and a human's willingness to trust that perception. Marcus watched the scene unfold with Scout pressed firmly against his leg. The dog remained calm, her alert complete, her communication successful. Scout hadn't needed to do anything more than her initial detection. She'd communicated the truth clearly and unmistakably. The human authorities had taken it from there, following proper procedures and protocols to ensure that the threat was neutralized. Scout seemed to understand this, seemed to recognize that her job was finished, that the situation was now in the capable hands of trained security personnel. As law enforcement officers from the Denver Police Department began to arrive at the checkpoint, called by Patricia's emergency dispatch, the true scope of what had been prevented began to emerge. A federal database search, conducted on tablets and laptops by TSA agents, revealed the suspect's real identity: Derek Thornton, age 42, a fugitive with outstanding warrants in 7 different states. The charges were staggering in their scope and severity. Identity theft in Colorado, where he'd stolen the credentials of not just Captain James Mitchell, but 3 other military officers over the course of 18 months. Wire fraud in California, involving the theft of approximately $850,000 from a small business. Credit card fraud in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. Bank fraud in Nevada. And most damning of all, a pattern of sophisticated financial crimes that had victimized dozens of individuals and organizations across the western United States. The detective who arrived to process the arrest, Detective Sarah Morrison of the Denver Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, reviewed the collected evidence with an expression of grave seriousness. She examined the forged military credentials, documents so skillfully created that they had fooled Patricia on initial inspection. She reviewed the airline booking information that had first triggered Patricia's suspicion. She interviewed the officers who had apprehended Thornton, listened to their descriptions of his attempted flight and his subsequent apprehension. "If this dog hadn't alerted," Detective Morrison said, looking directly at Scout with undisguised respect, "this man would be on Flight 247 to Washington, D.C. right now, disappearing into the Capitol with stolen credentials and a completely fabricated identity. He would have boarded a commercial aircraft, an aircraft carrying 247 passengers and 16 crew members, and escaped into a jurisdiction where extradition might have been complicated. By tomorrow, he could have been in Canada. By next week, he could have been in Mexico. By next month, he could have been anywhere on the planet with access to an international airport." The magnitude of what Scout had prevented became staggeringly apparent. Not just the prevention of one criminal's escape, but the protection of hundreds of innocent people who had no idea how close they'd come to traveling on an aircraft with a fugitive imposter. Scout had perceived a truth that no human security measure, no standard technology, no conventional security protocol could have detected with such absolute certainty. News of Scout's incredible detection spread through Denver International Airport like wildfire before the morning shift officially ended. By 9:00 a.m., officers from every security checkpoint in the terminal were talking about the German Shepherd who had caught a fugitive imposter. By noon, the story had reached the local media outlets through official TSA press releases and unofficial conversations between officers and their family members. By evening, Denver's television news stations were running feature stories about the remarkable detection dog and her handler. By the following morning, national media outlets had picked up the story, recognizing the extraordinary nature of what had transpired. The headlines were consistent in their emphasis on Scout's exceptional abilities. TSA dog detects what humans couldn't see. German Shepherd stops fugitive at Denver Airport. The dog who caught the criminal. Scout's instinct prevents major security breach. News helicopters circled Denver International Airport, their cameras documenting the arrival of law enforcement personnel, the coordination between federal and local authorities, and the systematic processing of evidence related to Derek Thornton's arrest. National news networks requested interviews with Marcus and Scout. Cable news shows debated the implications of the incident for airport security nationwide. Social media exploded with stories about Scout's heroic detection, with thousands of people sharing, commenting, and celebrating the remarkable dog's contribution to public safety. The TSA administration moved quickly to capitalize on the positive public relations opportunity, while simultaneously acknowledging the genuine significance of what Scout had accomplished. Regional Director Jennifer Holmes held a press conference at Denver International Airport exactly 36 hours after Thornton's apprehension. The conference room was packed with reporters, photographers, and media personnel from across Colorado and neighboring states. Director Holmes stood at a podium with Marcus and Scout positioned prominently beside her. "What occurred at Gate B7 on Tuesday morning," Director Holmes began, her voice carrying the weight of official authority, "represents the absolute pinnacle of what our K-9 detection units can accomplish. Officer Chen and Scout didn't just perform admirably. They prevented a potentially catastrophic security breach. They protected hundreds of innocent travelers. They apprehended a fugitive with outstanding warrants across 7 states. They demonstrated why K-9 detection remains an irreplaceable component of our security infrastructure." The director turned to Marcus directly, her expression conveying profound respect. "Officer Chen, your trust in your partner's judgment, your willingness to act on Scout's alert despite initial evidence suggesting legitimacy, your commitment to the principle that your dog's senses perceive truths that human inspection cannot detect. That is exactly the kind of partnership we need in modern airport security." Marcus accepted the commendation with characteristic humility, his hand resting gently on Scout's head. He spoke briefly to the assembled media, his voice steady but clearly emotional. "Scout is an extraordinary dog. She has capabilities that transcend standard training. She perceives something about Derek Thornton that no human inspector could have detected. The credit belongs entirely to her. I simply had the privilege of trusting her judgment and acting on what she was communicating." The TSA awarded Marcus their Medal of Bravery during an official ceremony conducted at TSA headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. The award recognized not just Scout's detection, but Marcus's professional judgment in trusting his partner despite evidence that initially suggested the suspect was legitimate. The ceremony was attended by TSA leadership, federal law enforcement officials, and representatives from the Department of Homeland Security. Scout received official recognition as an exemplary detection dog, her performance record now permanently documented in TSA training materials and case study archives. More significantly, Scout's story was featured prominently in TSA training videos distributed to K-9 handlers across the entire United States. The training material, titled "Trust Your Partner's Instincts," documented the entire sequence of events from Scout's initial alert through Thornton's apprehension. K-9 handlers nationwide were required to review the material as part of their continuing professional development. The lesson was clear. Human handlers must trust their dog's exceptional sensory capabilities, even when objective evidence initially suggests legitimacy. The real Captain James Mitchell, stationed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, was eventually contacted by federal investigators. He was informed that his military identity had been stolen and used in an attempted airport security breach. When briefed on the full scope of what had occurred, the meticulous forgery, the narrow escape, the crucial role that Scout's detection had played, Captain Mitchell became deeply emotional. He wrote a personal letter to Marcus and Scout that would subsequently be framed and displayed in the TSA office at Denver International Airport. "I learned today that my identity was used by someone attempting to commit fraud and evade justice. I learned that had it not been for an exceptional detection dog and an officer willing to trust that dog's judgment, a dangerous criminal would have escaped into the world. I learned that Scout, an animal I will never meet, protected not just the hundreds of passengers on that aircraft, but in some profound way protected my own integrity by preventing the misuse of my identity from succeeding. I am deeply grateful to Officer Chen and Scout. I am grateful that my name was used to catch a criminal rather than aid in one's escape. I would like to meet Scout personally to thank her for her service to public safety. Captain Mitchell's letter became part of Scout's official record, a testament to the far-reaching implications of her detection work. Derek Thornton faced federal prosecution in a coordinated effort involving law enforcement from 7 states. Federal prosecutors built an airtight case based on the evidence collected at Denver International Airport, combined with investigative material from across the western United States. Thornton's sophisticated criminal operation was systematically documented. The identity thefts, the financial frauds, the wire transfers, the stolen credentials, the meticulous planning that had nearly succeeded in helping him escape justice. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Thornton's defense attorney attempted to argue that the use of forged credentials, while serious, didn't necessarily indicate an intention to commit crimes while aboard the aircraft. The prosecution countered with evidence of Thornton's outstanding warrants, his pattern of identity theft, and his demonstrated intention to flee the jurisdiction where he faced criminal charges. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: identity theft in 3 separate incidents, wire fraud involving over $3 million in combined losses, bank fraud, credit card fraud, and attempting to board a commercial aircraft under false credentials. The judge sentenced Thornton to 15 years in federal prison, with additional state sentences to be served consecutively in several jurisdictions. In her sentencing statement, the federal judge made specific reference to Scout's role in preventing Thornton's escape. This defendant's sophisticated criminal operation would likely have succeeded had it not been for an exceptional detection dog whose senses perceived truths that human inspection could not access. That dog, Scout, deserves recognition for her contribution to justice and public safety. Scout's career at Denver International Airport continued unchanged by the publicity and recognition. She returned to her daily patrols at Gate B7, performing her detection work with the same professional dedication that had always characterized her service. The incident that had made her famous among law enforcement circles and national media outlets didn't alter her fundamental nature. She remained focused, dedicated, and committed to her work. But for Marcus, and for everyone at Denver International Airport, everything had changed. They now understood with absolute certainty the extraordinary value of the partnership between human and canine, the irreplaceable contribution that Scout made to security, and the profound importance of trusting a partner's senses when those senses perceived truths that human inspection could not access. A year and a half had passed since that fateful Tuesday morning when Scout's extraordinary detection had prevented Derek Thornton's escape and protected hundreds of innocent travelers. The autumn sun of the following year painted Denver International Airport in familiar shades of orange and gold as Marcus Chen stood once again at Gate B7 with his remarkable partner. Scout, now slightly grayer around the muzzle, the silver hairs a testament to her advancing age and years of dedicated service, pressed against Marcus's leg, with the same ritualistic greeting that had marked the beginning of every shift for the past 4.5 years. But Scout was no longer simply a detection dog working at one checkpoint among many at Denver International Airport. She had become something of a legend within law enforcement circles across the entire United States. Her story had transcended the initial media frenzy to become a teaching tool, a case study, a symbol of the irreplaceable value of canine detection units in modern security operations. Canine handlers from airport security agencies, federal law enforcement, and local police departments had all studied Scout's case as part of their professional development. Police academies used her story to demonstrate the importance of trusting a partner's instincts. Universities studying animal behavior referenced the case in lectures about canine sensory capabilities and the human-animal bond. Marcus had been promoted to senior K-9 handler 3 months after Thornton's apprehension. In his new position, he oversaw the training and management of 4 additional detection dogs at Denver International Airport. More importantly, he had become a mentor to younger officers working with canine partners. He spent considerable time teaching these officers the most crucial lesson he had learned from his partnership with Scout. Trust your partner's instincts, even when objective evidence initially suggests otherwise. Trust what they sense. Trust what they perceive. Trust that their extraordinary sensory capabilities access truths that human inspection cannot reach. The training seminars that Marcus conducted for new K-9 handlers always began with the same video. The footage of Scout's alert at Gate B7, the moment of tension and uncertainty, Patricia's discovery of the inconsistency, and the subsequent apprehension of Derek Thornton. Watching the video, new handlers could see exactly what Marcus meant when he spoke about trusting a partner. They could witness Scout's unwavering certainty, her refusal to be swayed by evidence that suggested legitimacy, her absolute commitment to communicating what her senses had detected. Scout's story was also featured prominently in TSA training videos distributed to every airport in the United States. Trust your partner's instincts had become required viewing for all K-9 handlers nationwide. The video had been translated into multiple languages for international security agencies. Law enforcement organizations from Canada to Australia had requested permission to incorporate Scout's case into their own training programs. A documentary filmmaker had approached Marcus about creating a full-length feature film about Scout's life and career, an offer that Marcus had politely declined, preferring to allow Scout to continue her work without the distraction of celebrity status. On quiet mornings before her shifts began, Marcus would sit beside Scout in the empty Gate B7 checkpoint, scratching behind her ears as she rested her head on his lap. These moments had become sacred to both of them, a time of quiet connection before the chaos of the day descended upon the checkpoint. Scout would look up at him with those intelligent amber eyes that had seen so much, understood so much, perceived truths that most creatures would never access. Those eyes held a wisdom that transcended words, a knowledge written in the language of scent and instinct and profound sensory perception. Marcus would speak to Scout during these moments, telling her stories about the travelers they'd screened, the connections they'd made, the security threats they'd prevented. "You know what's remarkable about you, Scout?" he would ask, though the question required no answer. "You don't do this work for recognition. You don't do it for medals or fame or the gratitude of the people you protect. You do it because you love your job. You do it because you love me and because you understand that your work matters. That's what makes you truly extraordinary." The real Captain James Mitchell had made good on his intention to visit Denver and meet Scout personally. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in June, exactly 17 months after his identity had been stolen and used in Derek Thornton's attempted escape. He wore his full dress uniform, the same uniform that Thornton had attempted to replicate so carefully. Captain Mitchell carried with him a special treat for Scout, premium beef jerky made by a small business in Germany that specialized in gourmet dog treats. When Marcus brought Scout to meet the real Captain Mitchell in a quiet corner of the airport, something extraordinary occurred. Scout, who rarely demonstrated overt emotion or excitement during working hours, became unusually animated. She sensed something in Captain Mitchell, perhaps recognition of his authentic military bearing, perhaps perception of his genuine emotional state. Captain Mitchell knelt beside Scout, and the dog pressed her head against his chest, her tail wagging with an enthusiasm she rarely displayed during her professional duties. "Thank you," Captain Mitchell said softly, his voice filled with emotion that transcended professional formality. Thank you for protecting my identity. Thank you for preventing this criminal from escaping. Thank you for being exactly what you are." Scout responded by licking his face, her entire body communicating affection and recognition. The moment was captured by a photographer from the Denver Post, a photograph that would subsequently be featured in articles about Scout across multiple publications. Before Captain Mitchell left, he spent nearly an hour talking with Marcus about the implications of what Scout had accomplished. They discussed the security breach that had been prevented, the criminal who had been apprehended, the hundreds of travelers who had been protected by Scout's extraordinary perception. Captain Mitchell asked detailed questions about Scout's training, her capabilities, her history before she'd arrived at Denver International Airport. "What's most remarkable," Captain Mitchell observed, "is that this dog perceived my identity, the authentic version, was being violated. She understood that something was fundamentally wrong with someone using my credentials fraudulently. She perceived not just deception but the specific deception of identity theft. That's extraordinary." Marcus nodded in agreement. Scout doesn't work in categories. She doesn't think about explosives or narcotics or identity fraud. She perceives truth and deception. She recognizes the chemical signatures of stress and dishonesty. She understands in her own way when something fundamental is wrong, when someone is engaged in deep deception that threatens public safety. Scout continued her daily patrols at Gate B7, performing her detection work with unwavering dedication. But she had become more than simply a working dog at a major airport. She had become a symbol, a representation of the extraordinary capabilities that existed at the intersection of human training and canine instinct. She represented the power of trust, the importance of listening to partners whose senses perceived truths that human inspection could not access, the irreplaceable value of the bond between handler and dog. On quiet mornings, as Marcus and Scout stood together at the beginning of another workday, watching Denver's morning light illuminate the airport's distinctive architecture, Marcus would think about the journey they had traveled together. From the nervous pup who had first arrived 4.5 years ago to the legendary detection dog who had prevented a major security breach and inspired changes in law enforcement training nationwide. Scout had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she had worked with, everyone her story had touched, everyone who had learned the crucial lesson that trusting a partner's instincts could literally save lives. Scout would press against Marcus's leg, her ritual greeting before another shift, and he would scratch behind her ears and whisper words of gratitude and affection. "Good girl, Scout. Good girl. Let's go to work." And together, handler and dog, they would walk into Gate B7, ready for another day of protecting the traveling public through the extraordinary partnership that had begun 4.5 years earlier, and had been forever transformed by one remarkable morning, when Scout's instincts had perceived the truth that no human inspection could access. Their story, the story of a dog and her handler, the story of trust and intuition, and the extraordinary capabilities that emerged from their partnership, would continue to inspire law enforcement professionals across the United States and around the world. Scout had found her purpose. Marcus had found his meaning. And together, they had discovered something far more profound than either could have imagined: the transformative power of trusting in a partner whose senses perceive truths written in the language of chemistry and instinct, in the invisible markers of deception, in the fundamental truth that separated authenticity from carefully constructed lies.